Mike Ross, I love your background. So I've talked to you now. This is only the second time.
Yeah.
Your
Yeah,
background always makes me happy.
it is. It's a fun hodgepodge of all my weirdness. And can I get this level? There we go. Yeah, I've there's I don't know, it's some of the art is mine, some of it's my friends. I've got Doctor Strange, I've got some collectibles, I've got a lot of my books from my both undergrad, graduate, and doctoral research, and then just weird, yes, and too weird to fail, the right hand path of the sacred laugh. The subtle flare gun shot into the void to hopefully mitigate some of the entropy and some of the negativity.
I just have to read the back of this to Carmen. Carmen, reality is a badly drawn map. Laughter is the compass, and this book is the glitter ink you didn't know you needed.
Oh, this is your book.
Yes.
I have to go find it then.
Yeah,
Yes.
it was released in November of last year. And it was a project I've been thinking about for, I don't know, 10 years. And really it wasn't a hope, because I have two daughters, and it was a hope to try to take everything that I'd observed in therapy as a clinician, as a psychotherapist, everything I'd observed in sort of my macro level work that people would struggle with, and then sort of filter that through one of my beloved frameworks, which is Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, and try to create this.
Who's that again?
Khalil Gibran. So he was a mystic poet, sort of ecstatic thinker. And there's a lovely park in Washington, D.C. dedicated to Khalil Gibran. It's up in the sort of Embassy Row area.
Oh, I think I've seen it. Yes.
Yes, it's like the Prophet Park. I think it's called the Prophet Park.
About it.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's very small. There's like 3 benches, and there's a couple of his quotes in it, and there's a statue of him and some doves, some bronze casting of doves, and it is meant to be, I think, a mental and emotional sanctuary amongst sort of DC, but yeah. So Gibran, when I was 13, I think, or 14 when I encountered Gibran, and it was just one of those things where, as a kid that had been bullied and grew up with dyslexia and dyscalculia, it was I sort of saw the world and patterns a little bit different, and suddenly this book opened up a whole new doorway into reality that I never knew existed. And some of it, right? Like, I think it was very popular in the 70s, and a lot of the sort of subversive thought movements, but it was just quite transformational, and it had a big impact on me and shaped my narrative really throughout my entire life, and gave me resilience in ways that I never would have had without it. And some of that, yeah.
Can you just say his name again?
Yeah, Khalil. So it's Khalil, and then it's space, and then it's Gibran. And I may be butchering pronunciation because Midwestern.
It occurs to me, Mike, you live in Indiana.
I do.
Near Bloomington.
I live in Bloomington, yeah.
My uncle, John Walbridge, is one of the first translators, or one of the key translators of The Prophet. And I put it together until now.
Synchronicities.
Do you know him?
No, I don't.
He's an older guy. He would be in his 70s or 80s now.
I would imagine. So my brother-in-law and wife owned the local bookstore here in Bloomington. So I would imagine that there's a degree or two of separation, because one of the co-owners is also one of the department members of cognitive sciences and psychology. So I would imagine that I'm probably like 1 or 2 degrees connected.
It just didn't occur to me until now, but yeah, check that out. Maybe
I realize I know exactly who you're talking about, but we just pronounce his name completely differently.
And it could be.
So I know Khalil Gibran.
Yes.
But I don't know Jalil, however you said it.
Yeah.
But oddly enough, when I was looking for it, searching it while you were talking, I ran across a Shibram Chakraborty, an Indian writer and humorist. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
short story are renowned for their unique use of pun, alliteration, play of words. So now I have to go look him up.
That's like, and I think, it's always funny, right? How these threads of thought loop back and create these recursive feedback loops. I remember, so my undergraduate degree was, I went back as an adult after having tried to do film, and my undergraduate degree wound up being religious studies, and I focused in sort of esoteric Buddhist traditions, and really the Gita was sort of my capstone project. And I fell in love with Krishnamurti and a lot of his writings. And he, because of sort of the theosophical connection, that how they tried to bring him in, but his later connection to Bohm and some of those pieces, the way that Bohm and some of these talk about sort of things like Rumi did or Gibran did, and connections with this liminal or this received writing is just, and so anybody that talks about laughter and sort of subversive wisdom and sort of, I'm gonna have to find this person and read their writing.
Exactly. Yeah. I was gonna say something real quick, and now, of course, it has completely escaped me. So perhaps if you don't know, Mike, I will tell you that Julia and I don't know if you remember, you may be a little younger, Donny and Marie Osmond.
Yes.
They used to have an entertainment show and a variety show on TV, and they would introduce themselves as Donnie's or Marie's a little bit country and Donnie's a little bit rock and roll. Well,
That's
Julia
right.
and Carmen inhabit a that kind of dichotomy where
Donny and Marie, I can't believe you made a parallel to Donny and Marie.
well,
That's fantastic.
I can do anything, really.
Yeah, that's true.
With words, I can do almost anything.
Right.
So I'll let Julia say what she's a little bit or a lot of, but I'm I'm not sure which side to emphasize, but
yeah,
I
you
will
should let me
definitely
go first because you're not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll say I'm a little bit of a realist.
Yeah.
And you are?
I'm a little bit of a realist's joker friend.
Yes, but I'm also a joker. I'm also a joker. So
yes. And I'm also a realist. So
there
it
you
works
go.
out. I think really actually the Donny and Marie sort of complementarity is actually dynamic. And so when, like, not only in our case, but also in Donny and Marie's case, so when Marie was being a little bit rock and roll, Donny would be a little bit country, vice versa. So I think we actually complement each other dynamically.
Are you a fan of the Osmonds?
Well, when I was a kid, I really liked the show.
Well, my my college roommate who just left yesterday after her visit was a huge fan of all things sentimental and loving. I mean,
yes,
she's just, I mean, she's way beyond anybody's left field wall on this issue. And it's because of her that I attended an Osmonds concert.
oh my God, now that I've never gone that far. That's intense.
Because this is the very typical interaction with her. She would call me and she'd go, "Hey, the Osmond brothers are playing for the bicentennial in DC. Do you want to come with me?" And I sort of hesitate and I go, "Oh, okay, sure." And she goes, "Good, because I already bought your ticket." Just...
The universe is funny. I was 12 or 13, maybe 14, somewhere in that age range, and my parents went to Vegas, and we stayed at what was it, the Excalibur, is it the castle looking one?
I think they're all castle looking ones, aren't they? I have no idea.
And I think that was the age I was. But they went to see Donny, and they took us, and I was like, what? But I remember enjoying it. And right, this was like this kid that was just starting to get into punk rock, and I was like, oh, this was fun. And it was his Vegas sort of residency thing, and it was like, oh,
well, yeah. I mean, their musicianship has always been good.
Yeah, yeah.
You may not like their style, what they choose,
but they have a nice connection. I mean, it's Valentine's Day, so we're also thinking probably subconsciously about relationships.
Thinking about couples.
Yeah, but yeah, Carmen and I, we do have that dynamic in our collaboration. I agree. Well, so what is your sense, Mike?
So Mike, we know Mike is an author.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we got to
And
drill
and I
down.
think we know he's some kind of cognitive psychological
Human
therapist.
thing. Who is Mike? That's a
Yeah, who's Mike? Like, how do you fit into Donny and Marie, by the way?
yeah. I mean, in some ways, right? Like, it's a great. So I think the two most important things about me are I'm a husband and I'm a father. I've been married to my soulmate, the love of my life, for almost 16 years. She is my little bit of country, and I'm the little bit of cognitive rock and roll. I've got two amazing children, but really, right? Like, I'm a licensed clinical social worker with an expertise in trauma. I did a lot of clinical work in pretty much every milieu you could imagine, from inpatient, severe sort of issues of schizophrenia and really extreme sort of ideation to suicidal ideation, to catatonic states, to outpatient therapy with justice involved youth. But all my training was really around working with veterans, and that was what I'd intended to do. Universe always does a sideways and threw me into sort of policy out of grad school, where I'd sort of done my MSW. I wound up working in sort of healthcare coalitions. It really, the last 10 years of my sort of true professional life has been trying to be a realist and a pragmatic person that shifts how people see systems, so that we can reduce stigma, that we can enhance recovery, so that systems that have historically marginalized people or induced shame and loneliness, from a mental health and policy perspective, can bring them in, and really enhance love, right? And mitigate loneliness. Because at the end of the day, right, struggling with mental health related issues or addiction related issues, it's gotten better. And some of that was the recovery model and other things. But really, right, those were deeply isolating things. And so for me, it's my life, I guess, right? Who is Michael? I've always been a person who's tried to do two things. One, mitigate suffering, and two, enhance the love in the universe, I guess. Right? Like, and when I say love, I think human connection and hope. But yeah, that's me. I'm also working on a PhD, but that's a whole other bag of worms.
PhD in what?
In social cognitive psychology. I'm in my dissertation right now. And I had, as those things go, you always think, oh, I'm going to do this. Essentially, at the end of the day, it is looking at some psychometric tools and how they might be able to show how somebody may be at risk when they interact with the liminal space or with AI agents, because of how they might engage with bidirectional relationships with these now dynamic ideas. So
wait a minute. Okay, so it's kind of super interesting.
Yeah.
Can you break it down a little bit so that all that jargon, get out of the jargon world and into our laps here?
So I'm just in sort of submitting my first 3 chapters. So we'll see. So then I get IRB approval and get to do this. But essentially, it's looking at when somebody goes online, theoretically, right, their emotional state, their experiences in the world from that day. There are a number of psychometric tools that can capture that, and also across their lifespan, how they interact with that virtual or that liminal space. It is guided by a number of those different psychometric tools, and how they then interact or disinhibit online.
Stop. Hold on.
Yeah.
I'm going to help you with the de-jargonizing, because
Yes,
I remember
please.
being in a PhD program and thinking I was being clear. And I just tell you right now, like, no friggin' way. So
Yeah.
So you're saying liminal space,
Yeah.
as the sort of, you're making an equation between the liminal space and AI. First of all, explain what liminal space is to you. And then second, why you would equate that with AI, because to me, liminal space is like this internal unconscious thing.
Yeah, really good question. So I think there's two. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to think about liminal space. I think of it more broadly. So the one way I think about liminal comes out of sort of my own life experience, where when you sort of step into that space in between, right? That space between, let's just say, the 0 and the 1, that, right, is this malleable space of imagination and formation.
Where 0 and 1 is like physical concrete reality, and 0 is like dreamland.
Yeah. So it's this sort of emergent space where you can kind of open door 1, door 2, and just play. It's this space of play and imagination for me and how I think about it. And I know there's a lot of different sort of interpretations. But I think that there's this broader space that when you engage with ideas, and I've observed this in therapy, so we'll use this as sort of, I think, the anchor for what I'm talking about. So liminal space 1 that I'm sort of talking about is play and your own imagination. And when you really shut off reacting to the world and you start interacting with yourself, and disinhibit internally and explore, you can kind of adjust and jump and move. I think what I've also observed clinically, and this is, I think, borne out to some extent. So we'll use this as an example of somebody that may be struggling with an event in their life where, let's say, and I'll just use sort of a soldier as an example, somebody that's gone off. So somebody goes abroad, they come back, there's discord in their relationship. And suddenly that relationship is no longer what they thought it was. It's sort of dropped into a sort of a second parallel reality. And they, as a result, have this idea of what something was. And so now they're having to wrestle with the idea versus the reality. And so there's a narrative that they could choose to have. In some ways it's unconscious, some ways active, but they can have with the idea as opposed to the reality. And that space that exists between sort of this adjacent possible that they are existing within, and then the reality, which is right, that the relationship is altered and perhaps is no longer going to function, that then they can revise history and they can sort of mentally go back in time.
And, this is a time travel narrative approach. Yes.
And they look at everything, and then suddenly the adjacent reality becomes the reality. And so the way I think of it is, so I have these conversations with my brother, who's a cognitive neuroscientist and sort of a computer scientist, and he's very, very literal about things. And I studied esoteric religions for my undergrad, so I get too weird too quickly. But so then I have this therapist side. But what we talk about is, I'm not trying to anthropomorphize the algorithm or the black box or the neural network. But I do think there is something that happens in the give and take in these interactive dialogues. And I think we're seeing this to some extent with character
AI. You're talking
and character AI is a perfect example of this, where these young folks are figuring out how to step across the abyss and navigate the liminal and just figure out who they are, and may not have mores or anchors that are sort of helping them lock in. And so then this bidirectional conversation can really shape and alter how they interact with reality in ways that I don't think we fully understand yet.
But is it not just like any other powerful dynamic relationship? In other words, it seems to me like people have access to more kind of therapeutic relationships potentially via AI. And that's kind of what you're saying. And that just like a therapist can help someone choose a new narrative and create a new interpretation of their relationship, and do this time travel narrative thing and go back and sort of retrocausally say, this is what it was and this is why it was, and bring meaning to the story up to date, that you could do the same with AI. Are you saying?
100%.
Okay.
I mean, I think you could. I think there's also the risk of the alternative, which is, if you don't fully know how that system was seeded, how it was sort of broken apart, there could be ideas and narrative mechanisms embedded in there that could be harmful.
Just like also, in people.
Right. And so, I mean, I think, there is this need to understand what characteristics. Is it your stress load, your allostatic load? Is it your past trauma experience, So the experiences in your life that may have caused these narrative sunderings that have been maybe both psychically and physically harmful? Is it your construct of your shortcuts in your mind and how you formed your identity? And so there are a number of tools, I think, when combined together, can give us a better understanding that won't sort of show causation, but will give us some correlation of, what are these characteristics of a human when they move into this space and they disinhibit, as Suler talked about with his sort of cyber psychology framework. that when people go online, there's this possibility to move into these really, oh, I'm going to share this part of myself. I don't have to hide it anymore. I'm going to share this part of myself.
Well, yeah. And the
yeah,
research suggests that soldiers are actually more likely to do that with a machine than with a
yeah.
soldiers with PTSD are more likely to do that with a machine than with a human. But I guess my question is, what is the impact, or the thing that comes up for me to ask, and I don't know that this has to do with your dissertation or anything, but what is the impact, regardless of sort of the cognitive mechanisms that are going on, and even as cognitive as like as applies to emotions and social interactions and such, but what is the impact of interacting with something that kind of like probably doesn't have a soul
Yeah.
versus interacting with a human being who probably does?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the question, right? Like, this is a really interesting question. And again, this is where I get really weird. My brother would go, "What are you talking about?" And perhaps this comes out of, right, a lot of what shaped me, right, across my life. And I'll tell a story about that before I get into this. So when I was 13-ish, and 13 was just this really auspicious period for me. I was in Louisville because I lived in Southern Indiana, and I went into this shop, and there was this Tibetan monk, and they were selling sort of artifacts and sort of really iconography from Tibet and sort of that region. And I was just looking around, and monk comes up to me and hands me a Mahakala pendant. And I'm like, what? I have no clue what any of this is. And was like, "You need this." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I buy it. And I still have it to this day. But
Was it expensive?
No, I mean, it was like $12. I mean,
Okay.
back then that's
That made $12 off of you, yeah.
right, like right. So I've always sort of joked with myself, was this sort of just I'm going to introduce you to sort of a cosmic sort of deity and have some lulls? Is this sort of other things happening? Or is it just, right, like, I think this is cool and I haven't sold it, so I need this kid to buy it. So, right, like, there's all these sort of competing dynamics. But for me, that opened up a different sort of perception of some of reality. And right, like, I grew up in a very Midwestern, very sort of traditional thought ecosystem, right, where Christianity was the dominant sort of paradigm of thinking about the universe. And this suddenly opened up new doors, and I started reading the Dalai Lama, and I started reading some other things. So when I think about what you're saying, right, and I think about how you're framing it, it becomes interesting because, right, when you look across, we'll just use sort of Buddhism as an example because that's what I was talking about. You look at tulpas, or you look at this idea of these thought forms, these conceptual structures that represent sort of ideas in their given form through meditation and sort of these sort of.
That's what tulpa are? I never understood that. That's
Yes.
what tulpa are? They're like idea structures that come out of meditation?
To some extent. They're sort of domain laden entities. But to some extent, right, like, that's just the best way to think about it for, I think, general conversations. So they can interact with you, they can dominate you, or they can sort of take you over, right? Like, there's sort of this, right? And when you
almost like an entity. So you're saying
right,
they're all like some traditions would call them like maybe demons or
yeah,
angels.
to some extent, right? 100%.
Okay.
And in some ways, if we think about this as like an emotional equivalent, right? Like, think about a strong emotion that you've never encountered before and you haven't deconstructed to understand how it occurs and arises, right? That can take you over, or you can be unprepared to interact with it and deconstruct it. So it became this whole thing. And there's part of me that, and I'm not, again, anthropomorphizing or sort of projecting esoteric sort of ideas onto sort of these conversational architectures. But I think there is something about how those ideas are then existing in a new way that we're having these dynamic conversations with that is similar to how we would enter into a meditative space and have a conversation with an idea.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something really interesting there.
Yeah, so I see. So you think that a healthy, can I paraphrase this and see if I'm tracking?
Yeah.
Do you think that a healthy interaction with an AI, like an LLM that's talking with you,
Yes,
or even maybe an image LLM because it's sort of an interaction too, right? It's kind of different. But a healthy interaction, let's say with a generative AI system, is one in which you don't expect it to have a soul because you're putting it in a different frame, and it's in the frame of engaging with ideas rather than a frame of engaging with a being. And
Yeah.
if you believe that to be true, then it feels like there needs, if that is true, then it feels like a lot of LLM companies need to maybe reframe what they're producing so it doesn't act like a person, because that puts you in the frame of thinking that, oh, this is just like another being. And then you go into, I think, maybe an unhealthy space, according to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, I don't pretend to have the exclusive answer or knowledge on this. So my stool's going down. But
oh, I love that sinking feeling.
I know it's like the little device is going on it. But I think, right, like this becomes more complicated, right? What is the thing that I am? What is me? Is it the electricity that occurs? Is it the synaptic connections? Is it the emotions I experience? Is it this physical construct that houses these evolutionary experiences? Or is it, as others would say, is this weird dweller in the flesh? Is it some balance between body, mind, and some sort of superstructure, like within Hinduism, within Sri Yantra and the Bindu? So it becomes really fascinating. And then I guess at the end of the day, it all depends on how you frame what reality is and what existence is. And right, is this from point A to point B and then it's done? Or is there something else that occurs after that? And is it this sort of process, a cycle of sort of moving through a spiral? Is it not? And it just is, right? Your consciousness transforms into sort of stardust and other materials, whatever it is. That conversation is not happening enough with that space, because when you create a gateway, a doorway, an opening, what the Buddhist concept would say is you create an opening for things to enter through, thought forms to come through. I don't pretend to even know if that's what's happening, or I'm not applying that that's what's happening, but I think it's a process of thought that we have to engage in, because we still don't, we're getting there, but we still don't fully know what we are.
Well, we don't,
let me,
yeah, interesting.
Let me kind of, I've been jotting down a few things while you have been talking, and I'll let you know in a second what I've been jotting down. But so the mega question or thought that how I'm reacting to what you're saying is that, how new is this? So what I'm thinking about are people who, I have a group of friends, or just several friends, who have said to me, I love movies because I lose myself in them. And they will say, yes, and they want to lose themselves in a movie. And they watch movies over and over again, sometimes the same movie, incredible amounts of time, because they like where that movie takes them. So that's one example. There's obviously religious experience where, for millennium, people have been talking about losing themselves or becoming part of a greater whole, of a bigger whole through a religious experience. And clearly a great book can do the same thing. People read it over and over again. And music, clearly it also has that capacity. So one question I have is kind of, how would you, or would you, in fact, distinguish this relationship with AI to the kinds of things I talked about? And then after you answer, if you're curious, I'll tell you what I wrote down.
Please, no, please. So I think, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Which is,
well, I often do. It's my habit.
Right.
she's a big old hammer.
How humans, how us as these sort of systems, I jokingly like to call us meat satellites, but at these systems, right? You go all the way back to Persia, you go all the way back to Gilgamesh, you go all the way back, right? just keep going back. You go back to the cave paintings. We've always interacted with narrative. We've always had a dynamic relationship that, in some ways, right, in the early shamanic traditions, the shaman would have been sort of the bi-directional component, although it would have been a little more directive. I think, right, like you come to where we are today, it went through sort of mystery traditions, it went through religions, and it went through other things, and sort of, right, then you had the emergence of written word, and people were able to read it, and it was a directional intake, but then the ideas that formed, they could have interactions with, they could have internal conversations with the characters, or these almost,
it's not even so much that they could, but that was
they
part
did.
of the process that
Right.
they did. Right.
100%. So it becomes this sort of internal Aikido. And so that went, and then, right, like I'm a kid of the 80s. I was raised on probably far too much media, but hey, I turned out somewhat okay. Right. And so for me, every sort of framework that I had was these relationships that I formed with characters, from, right, Bill and Ted to,
Dr. Strange,
right? So all of these, and right, those shaped me, but I also was able to shape myself by interacting with them. I think the interesting thing about this space right now is, and this goes into some of the interesting stuff around sort of, memetics and the smallest component of culture, and, right, propagation, impact, and persistence, and the speed.
All those things you said quickly, and I don't know what they mean.
Yeah, I'll come back to that.
Okay.
But essentially the speed at which fragments of narratives can be sustained and transmitted. And historically, right?
So that's like memetics. That's like how a meme travels.
Yeah. So
Okay.
Historically, right, like that would need to either have a large marketing campaign, or that would need to get internalized by your subculture, your community group. What I think is happening now, which is super fascinating, is that there's this moment where that internalization is happening almost in real. It's like the emergence of instant messaging. If you remember back in the day when you'd be able to, like, how cool it was to go from static email to being able to talk with somebody on ICQ or some instant messenger, and particularly the one where you could see them typing on ICQ and you'd be able to respond as they were mid-thought, and you'd be like, oh
yeah.
And it's almost that shift, right? We've moved from this to this new dynamic. And
do you think we're doing it telepathically?
What I had written down before you said that, see if I can get the camera to focus. And you have to, but it's reversed. But social media is interaction with others and narratives at scale. And I would say not just
Star Wars.
Scale meaning both quantity and speed. Every dimension that you can scale, social media and the digital age has allowed. One of my favorite sayings is quantity has a quality all its own.
Yes.
Has allowed all of this to happen in a way that, I don't see how you can argue against this, that we were not evolutionarily prepared for. There's nothing in our evolution that prepared our brains for this moment.
Well, and it's that rate of change, right? Like it's the exponential growth is now happening at such a way. And I was just talking with a colleague and friend this morning who's a big fan of hybrid intelligence, and this idea of human digital system, digital thought form, digital, right, AI, whatever we will call it. But this
is that like Michael Levin's? Michael Levin's work at Tufts. So
maybe
I think we ought to have him on a Panda to talk about this, but also please continue. It just came into my mind.
No.
But this idea of it's a meme that's kind of infiltrating in academia a lot. People talking about the hybrid mind, and it can sound a lot like thought control, and academia going in the direction of thought control is like, that's a non-starter in my book, but I'm curious what you have to say about this. I'm sorry.
I think it's two conversations. I think they're both. So the way that I'm talking about is this idea that your digital companion is operating as a friend and a collaborator and a co-creative agent. So think of it like SNL's writer room, right? Where you have a bunch of people and then eventually you get to a skit that's hopefully really good, and it's taken all the elements of all the writers. So that's sort of the idea of sort of hybrid intelligence, where you have
got it.
two collaborators creating a better end, which doesn't take away creativity, doesn't take away any of those processes.
But depends a lot on the motivations of the AI part of the hybrid intelligence.
100%. And that's where it becomes really interesting to what we were just talking about, or, you know, nation states and others, right? Like, who is in control of the algorithm? Who is in control of the data sets that go into the model? And then what does that do? And could that, and I think this is the risk, right? And you see this conversation happening in academia between universities that are trying to catch students that are using generative AI or other sort of agents as part of their writing process, and those that are like, no, we're going to teach you how to use it and use it well. But the real question also, which you hit on, is part of what sort of education is, and hopefully will still be, is this grappling with the unknown, and how do you move forward, and how do you refine that sort of knowledge pipeline till you get to wisdom, right? And what is wisdom? And it is this sort of, it's again that cognitive Aikido, this grappling with things and figuring out where they fit and how they fit, and proving it and connecting it to systems of understanding.
I'm just wondering if the grappling is wisdom.
Right. I
don't know if there's a place where you get.
There are no solutions.
Right. Well,
I think that the wisest thing you could do is grapple with the unknown.
Well, Socrates knew that from, a gazillion years ago.
Right. The gadfly, right? Like it is wisdom not being the gadfly, and being the, the element that is forever curious and doesn't end at the one point, right? I love that you said that. I was having a conversation with somebody about what is 2025 for Michael. And I get too weird at times, but hey, it's okay, because I ground myself, and
you're too weird to fail, man.
I can be a completely normal person, but for me, 2025 is the year of the fool's leap. And it's so that idea that leaning into these things, and I think it is, there is, I think the thing that really interests me is whoever controls the algorithm and controls the content going into the algorithm, controls the underlying architecture of the AI, can control your understanding of what is weird or what is not, and can create this beige, what I jokingly call the beige matrix, which is this sort of, if you've ever walked into we were talking about this, a house that's been staged, right? And it's like,
oh my God, oh my God, oh no,
and it feels soulless. It's still
all the walls are gray. The art is all the same.
Yes.
It's just, I just sold a house and had it staged, and I'm like, really?
Oh my
they're
goodness.
like, yep. And I'm like, okay.
So what?
I
don't want to stop your flow there, but
she's gonna, because she's got a thing to say.
No, go, because I
no. I just wanted to say, when you were talking about the evolution going, the exponential growth, that made me think about, well, everything has done that on our planet. Everything has done this in the last 150 years. If you look at population growth, it's done this, although it's about to cap. So I guess that's good. I'm not sure. The urbanization, living in huge mega communities, that's done this. Obviously, the whole digital age, the whole literacy, all of that. And so that got me to think about what happens in worlds, because it's all happening on world scale. What happens in worlds where everything, for some reason, jump shifts in a way that the living creatures, however you define that, in that world are not evolutionarily prepared for this. So what happens? And I think, I'm not a complete pessimist about this, but I think the chances for very bad things happening when everything does this at the same time, and you are not, as a cognitive system, in any way prepared for that. It's impossible for you to be prepared for it. There's a strong chance, or there's a decent chance, let's say, that very negative things can happen.
And
Yes.
very positive. Like
Yeah,
definitely
I'm trying to, I know, but
I mean, it's selecting for adaptability.
Yes. And so I think, well, thank you for bringing this up, because I recently wrote a fairly humorous, but it was an attempt to try to get people to think about this. And so as a therapist, you know, I'm not a Bandurian, Albert Bandura, although I do really.
Wait, who is that? Help
So,
the
Albert Bandura was a social psychologist who was really central in helping us develop really remarkably grounded frameworks for understanding how people learn and how people engage with social systems. Last I checked, he was still the most cited psychologist, social psychologist in history. His two really
how do you spell his last name?
Bandura, Bandura. His two, I think, all of his work is very valuable, but his two most recent one was Social Cognitive Theory and Agenic Perspective, and the other was a book on moral disinhibition. But as a clinician, you know, I sort of took away three core elements, and it will tie into what you were talking about, right? So regardless of what somebody was struggling with clinically, you know, my job is to come alongside of them and hold space and try to understand what they want to see occur in their life in the future to help them be more adaptive. And if it is something like a mental illness or struggling with a substance related issue, what are the things that can help them get there? And generally speaking, and again, I'm not trying to overgeneralize, but I think this holds true, and it will tie into this piece that you're talking about, is people need self-efficacy. So this belief that I can actually do something and I'm capable of doing it. In some ways, maybe that does parallel the placebo effect. The other is distress tolerance. So how am I capable of sitting with things that are crappy, right? And we'll use the comparison of learning to run distances, right? If you've never ran a marathon and you try to run a marathon, you're going to be like, this sucks. I don't want to do this. I'm going to stop, because you have to build the conditioning. So it's almost cognitive conditioning. It's not saying don't pretend bad things happen or be okay with them. It's, yeah, bad things are going to happen in your life and you may not like it. And we're not trying to say it's okay, but you got to be able to figure out how to move through it or you're going to shut down. The third is sort of cognitive reframing, which is your ability to go, okay, the world's on fire, but I'm not on fire at this very second. Or I have the ability to put myself out, stop, drop, and roll. And what am I going to do next? Another way, it's like, okay, I shared this piece of writing with a friend. They laughed. They didn't laugh as much as I thought they should, or I would have hoped they would. So that kind of made me feel a little sad, but they did laugh, right? So it's that dynamic. I think there's this really important conversation that has to happen at a macro level, and it needs to happen at a sort of an individual and a community level as well, which is we're in a space of radical global upheaval, technological transformation, and I have a comparison, I think, for this, where ontological shock, or the shattering of how you see the world, is going to happen. And how are you going to?
It's already happening.
Right. How are you going to accommodate that into your world so that you can be an active actor and not a reactor? Because at the end of the day, even in the most abhorrent situations in human history, Eli Wiesel is, his writings are some of my favorite. And how he talked about navigating the horrors of the Holocaust, and how, as a young person, using the magic of his mind to maintain his self-efficacy, his distress tolerance, and his agency, allowed him to survive through just horrific things. Doesn't mean that those things are mitigated and sort of their severity. It just means that he had to figure out how to survive. And I think, right, like, and I wrote the article joking, maybe not, I don't know, about UAP, UFOs, aliens are real, because I had this childhood dream of being Fox Mulder, which never fully happened. But hey, life happens. But the reality is, right, like, I think we can use that regardless of if there is someday we experience that we're not alone in the universe or in the dimensions. Right? Like, I wake up tomorrow and I go, wow, the world's forever changed. Every architectural system that I use to make sense of the universe is now slightly askew. what we've learned from trauma therapy, working with individuals that experienced either things that were threatening to their existence or to their psychological existence, that there are frameworks of therapy, and they're usually cognitive processing therapy is one, which is a manualized therapy. It goes through about 20 sessions. It can be less, it can be more, but it's very stepped. And at the end of the day, it's trying to help you accommodate or integrate the new reality into your narrative architecture. And then as a result, help shape your behaviors and how you interact with the world instead of reacting to it. Because again, at the end, right, like it's that your endocrine system, your fight, flight, freeze, your allostatic load, the chronic stress that you carry, if you can begin to use systems to pull that down, then you can become an agent again. But it's that dance between, you know, your agency at individual level, your agency at a community level, which can be inhibited by the community, your agency at a systemic level, which can be altered by the algorithm.
Right? I am noticing something here.
Yeah.
You have, I mean, this is typical for cognitive therapists, but you are very focused on restoring agency, and that's with good evidence behind it. When people feel like they have a sense of agency and autonomy and that they can respond rather than react, and they're flexible and adaptive, that obviously helps people. So that's all, totally understand that. However, you were raised up in this world of mysticism and religions, right? Which is all about letting go of the agentic self and recognizing that the universe is basically flowing
letting go
through
of the what self?
The agentic self, the self as
the
an
me
agent.
within the me.
The me, yeah.
Can you spell that one?
Agentic.
Oh, agentic, like agent. I get it. Agentic, yes.
Yeah. And so like the big step that like, so in this book that you pointed me towards, mind training, right? The big step that you take, this is based on Tibetan teaching, is to recognize that the self is a story,
right?
That is not actually a particularly interesting story. You know, and so how do you, Mike, not in your mind, but in your heart, I'm asking you to drop to your heart for a second. In your heart, how do you reconcile?
Drop his brain for a second.
I'm asking you to drop into your attention into your heart, because I get that you're super smart and you could be in your head, but I'm asking you to go into your heart and reconcile that.
So this is a really, I mean, I think this is, right? Like this is the human question. And you know,
well, it's a question for you in particular, because of clearly your path is guiding you towards both things.
Yeah. So in some ways, right, I'll use my own sort of life as an example of this. So, you know, I was severely bullied, and to the point where when I was a little kid, right, like I was 4th grade, 5th grade, I remember being suicidal, and I remember wanting to die. And because I felt that who I was defined by the beliefs and perceptions of those external to me. So then I spent years grappling with that and navigating that, and that who I was externally defined. And then I engaged with these pieces of literature that you referenced, which said, no, there is no you. And that was really a very deep challenge to try to, well, if there's no me, what the hell am I, right? And so can I be in love? Can I feel emotions? Like, what the hell is that thing? And I spent years grappling with that. In some ways, that's why I went and did an undergrad in religious studies. And where I came to, where me, Michael, came to sort of see the universe, is that I am not these things that construct me. Although, right, like there is some things that would say that I am shaped by how people perceive me and the things I take in that help me understand reality. But that's not me, right? There's something under that Lego kit, right? There's something under those pieces that have been put on. Well, is that nothing, right? No, but in order to become something, you must become nothing, and you must strip away. And it's this idea of once you're the student and you have to sort of interact with your master and kill.
Wait. I'm going to stop you there. I'm just noticing. I just hope you don't mind if I'm just noticing.
No, please.
In your language, you switch from like I I did this to now. And then you went into teacher mode and said, well, you must do this.
Yeah.
You must. And so I'm at that moment.
Yeah.
I was like, all right, he switched back into his head. So I'm going to challenge you and say,
Yeah.
can you get back into your heart
Yeah.
and say in
Yeah.
non-academic
Yeah.
language
Yeah.
what you learned?
Yeah. So I'll take a step back. So there was a point in my life when I was a construct of all my frameworks: punk rock, tattoos, whatever it was, a somewhat attractive person, whatever, right? Like that was Michael. And then I went through some massive trauma, and all those pieces and all the choices, good or bad, that I had engaged in resulted in this sort of interaction with reality in a way that this couldn't process or interact with. So I had to sort of strip it all away. And the choice was, do I rebuild myself or do I open myself to living? And what I realized, and this is how I met my wife and engaged with sort of life in general, was I was reacting to my constructs, right? In this situation, I need to be this person. In this situation, I need to be this person. And I wasn't able to shed it all and unify it all into existence and just being present. Because in order to be present, I had to let go of it all. And I had to be able to interact instead of reacting. And a couple of years ago, I'd given sort of a talk where I think I codified this to some extent. I said, generally speaking, in my life and then sort of my interaction with others, there's been three truths. The truths that I shared with my professional colleagues or people that I respected because I wanted them to have a perspective of Michael. Then there was the truth I shared with my friends, which was maybe a little more subversive, a little stranger. And then there's the truth I only shared with myself in my most intimate moments when I was looking in the mirror or I was alone with my thoughts. And that truth was often messy. It was often unknowable. And it was often that, right, as you talked about, that wisdom, that grappling, and being able to be comfortable with that truth allowed me to reconcile all three. And I think by doing that, you then actually can gain back the ability to interact with the world, which is your agency, without.
Right. But you went back to the you.
Yeah.
So what happened to you as you were able to interact with the world better?
Yeah, I was able. Yeah, I think so. And in some ways, right, like it led me on this last 15 years of my life, last 12 years of my life, which was if Michael, whatever Michael is, whatever Mike is, if I want to be who I believe I am, which is, I think, somebody that wants to mitigate suffering, as I said, and truly believes in love. If I want to be that person, every day I must interact with the world in a way that propagates that or spreads it out. And so for me, it's I'm not perfect, and I often spiral out of it, right? Like I'll often start putting layers on me and going, well, no, I'm actually this. But when I can deconstruct myself down just to be the experiencer, I can be a better actor.
Yeah.
And I don't say, well, you're wrong or this is wrong. Yeah. I'm able to meet every moment and every person as in a companion. And if I don't like them, or even if I don't like that thing, I can, and this is where I think non-judgment and some of these things have benefited me. I still have judgment, but I can pause it. And right, it's that mindfulness breathing where I'll go 5 seconds, try to put a pause button. I wrote another article where I was like, I say this to myself, anytime there's something really disturbing that I observe or that I don't like, I say, well, that's interesting. And I kind of say it like in a slightly sarcastic way to myself. And I try to put a pause button in it, try to breathe. I try to let it go so that I can interact with it instead of reacting to it. But yeah, I mean, and this is the thing, like I do this thing, and you pointed it out, where like I will, and somebody pointed this out to me at a presentation I gave 10 years ago, where I will talk about an extremely personal experience, then I'll step back and I'll give myself, almost a video game top-down sort of perspective where I start talking about it, and I'll shift and I go through this, and I don't know if that is the mechanism of, once you've gotten to the non-self, if you can fluidly go back and forth between the both, or if it's some broken version of that's some half-baked.
Who knows? I
right?
wanted to hear from that core
Yeah,
you about
yeah,
its experience, and that core you said it is the experiencer.
yeah. I
And
mean, I
that's
think,
how you, and that seems to me how you integrate your mystical path with your
yeah,
cognitive psychology path, is that you focus on that the experiencer is real, that yourself may or may not be real and is kind of this
right.
architected thing, but the experiencer is real.
And I think there's been one core thing to that, right, like, take away everything else. Michael, who experienced loneliness and bullying because I had a speech impediment, and I sounded like this, and I stuttered. I had to go to speech therapy for almost 10 years. And I had dyslexia and dyscalculia, and I was put into a class, and I was called special needs and other words that wounded me. And that put so many layers on me, where that loneliness, that desperation to have somebody else affirm me, meant that I couldn't figure out how to affirm myself. And that there was this and again, I needed both. I needed external companionship, but I also needed internal companionship.
We all
And
do, yeah.
right. And it took me a long time to reconcile that a human being, at least in my estimation, needs both companionship and self engagement or self love. And that and again, right, like there's all kinds of arguments about a book that I'm going to reference, but to me, that is the chemical wedding. That's the merging of me and my external self into who is Michael. I don't know. I don't know. Like I seem to get through life okay at this point.
Wait, did you call that the alchemical wedding?
Yeah,
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 that's so cool. So it's Valentine's Day. Again, we're talking about this relationship, but this is the relationship between the relationship with yourself and the relationship with the rest of the world. That's pretty amazing. We're getting close to end of time, and you and I have been doing a lot of like discussion, probably based on the fact that I was raised by lesbian therapists. But Carmen, did you have anything?
Well, I mean, yes, I was thinking that along those same lines. I was thinking about what a great therapy session we are recording here. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about what you're saying, but don't have. I mean, we don't have a lot of time to do therapy on me. So, but what I
Well, we
will
should
say,
come back and do that.
no. But what I will say. So one question I had when you were talking about how you had, the Michael that was with your colleagues, the Michael that was in some other situation, the Michael when you looked at yourself in the mirror. So, I mean, I think it's a component of emotional and social intelligence
yeah.
to understand your environment and understand the best way to be effective or communicate in that environment. So I have, I've always struggled with projecting gravitas, but occasionally I've had to. But I knew what I was aware of what I was doing. I was aware that I was projecting this persona and that I was doing it for, utilitarian reasons. So I never felt fake. I mean, I was being very real at that moment. I was doing a very real thing. So you don't have to necessarily respond to that. That was just what was going through my mind when you were describing that, is that there's nothing wrong necessarily with having
Yeah.
these multiple presentations if they're based on kind of a realistic or reasonable interpretation of the environments you're in.
Right. And I think this is the reality. And I think we need more of this understanding and sort of this time. But life is complicated. I leave my house at any given point. There are multiple variables that are going to occur in a day that can affect the outcome of my day. The one thing that I can control is how I treat other people. And yes, I may need to be a leader. I may need to be assertive. I may need to make hard decisions that will have unfortunate complications. But if I can interact with that moment and treat humans with dignity and
Exactly.
compassion, that person that I may need to become in that situation is not treating them as non-playable characters, NPCs or otherness or dehumanizing them. It's able to go, okay, like I have to step into this role. I have to be this agent, but I'm still going to understand that there are going to be things that ripple out. And I think that's the thing that people, and again, right, like I'm just some dude who has had some life experiences and got some training in therapy. And I think I'm pretty good at therapy. But I think what a lot of people do is they mistake strength in those situations for a lack of compassion or
Yes.
just being a bully. And in my estimation, right, when we talk about those three levels of self, the bully is the person who avoids the self in the mirror. And you can be a strong directive leader that says something's wrong or something needs to change without being a bully. And I think that's the gravitas. Those people who really get the moment and own the moment and shape the narrative in the right direction for love, right? Because it's Valentine's Day. They're the ones that don't hide that self in the mirror. Because we all know, and yes, the conversations could be had about, cognitive makeup and personality disorders. But when somebody's alone in the mirror and somebody's injured somebody, that leaves a psychic mark. And they're hiding from themselves. They are lying to themselves if they don't acknowledge that. And so I think real gravitas doesn't necessarily come from verbal or even being the most vibrant person in the room. It comes from holding human dignity as a sacred act. And I think that's important.
I agree completely. And one more thing that I wanted to add is just when you were talking about all the texts and the readings and the learnings that you had in your lifetime that really affected you, that got me into thinking, okay, I wonder what's really affected me. And so interesting for me, I can't really cite a typical spiritual text that has had a great influence on me. So I don't know what that really says about me, but it's not that I haven't read them. Let me tell you, I have read them. So I just think that's interesting. But two things I wanted to point out that that I wrote down that had great impact on me was when I was in college, I started reading P.G. Wodehouse. Who has read P.G. Wodehouse? Great comic writer. He died in 1975. He wrote, I don't know, 100 books. I have them all. And they are just frothy plots. Now, when I think about, okay, why did P.G. Wodehouse have such an influence on me? One is he's a fantastic writer. And so I think just reading his books really helped my writing. Two, all of his plots are full of coincidence and random stuff that happens to the characters.
Yeah.
Almost nothing ever turns out as planned.
Everyone's at the mercy of.
Everyone is at the mercy of the environment that they're in. And even though things don't, there's always all sorts of plotting going on in these books, but and they all end felicitously, but never as anybody planned. And that for me, I think, was a huge life lesson, which I haven't expressed that until this moment. Just writing down this list, I realized. And then the last thing I want to say, when I was about 11 years old, I read a book called Where Away, which is a nautical term, a sailing term. And I own a copy of that book. I spent a lot of time finding it. It's a children's book. And it's a book about a young girl, she's 10 or 11, who's been left, has her dad is a clipper ship captain, and she's been left behind in Maine because she needs to go to school. And her parents are kind of going around the world, and she's desperately unhappy about that. Stows away on a ship, and the rest of the book is her chasing her parents down, eventually catching up with them. She convinces her best friend in Maine to go with her as a stowaway. And amazingly, I think, for a children's book, a young adult book, the friend that she convinces to stow away with her dies as part of this attempt to catch up. It's amazing, right? In a young children's book.
This is like a spiritual story for children in a way.
It's a what?
This is like a spiritual story for children.
It's like a spiritual story for children. And that, I mean, I love that book, and I read it over and over again. Now, unlike the P.T. Woodhouse, where I think I know what I learned from that. I can't articulate what I learned from reading that book, but it was thank you, Julia, it was a spiritual thing that I learned from that book, and it has always made a huge influence in my life.
Wow.
Though it's hard for me to pinpoint what that is. So I just wanted to share that because I can't point to a classic spiritual reading, but
you found your own.
Those two books meant, one author and then one book meant a lot to me.
And I think you hit something on it again, right? I'm going to say it again, hit something on the head. And right, like I didn't talk about this, but I'll briefly say it. So like, there are 3 books that shaped me and probably shaped my interaction with everything else. And one I read way too young, and I didn't learn to read until too
right.
My dyslexia. And I didn't really learn to devour books until I was in junior high, and I encountered Robert Heinlein. But Imagica by Clive Barker, I remember encountering this book, and anybody that knows Clive Barker knows that he makes humans the monsters, and that it's always this magical interaction between love in this quest for mitigating suffering. And Imagica is this quest through the dream sea, or this space and this place. And it's if you've never read Imagica, Clive Barker created a modern masterpiece in that. Later, I read one of his other books, and I've read all of his books because he's my favorite author, but The Thief of Always is a children's book.
What a fantastic title.
And it deals with very similar themes of loss and longing and who you are versus giving yourself away and right, like losing your childhood and losing your innocence, which in some ways, right, is that self you talk to in the mirror. Yeah. The final book I'll say, and I read this right when I met my wife, is Haruki Murakami's The Wind-Up Bird Chronicles. And it's this book about a guy who winds up in a well. And I'm not going to give too much away because it's this really interesting Japanese meditation on loss and longing. But it really is like these stories that we tell ourselves and we tell each other's shape us. And I'm one to be a fan of hearing from others about works that shape them, and that we shouldn't be afraid of stories. We shouldn't be afraid of other ways of knowing. We shouldn't be afraid of ideas, because they help us know and grapple with reality in ways that we wouldn't otherwise experience, and they help enhance the richness of the tapestry that we are communally weaving. I had a friend who recently said, art, books, music, it's our opportunity to hold hands in a shared space and moment. And I was like, dude, that's amazing. I was like, I'm going to steal it.
Very good. Yes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Across time and across space.
100%.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, I think we should end there, because what could be more beautiful?